Hi, everyone. This is Jeff Clapes from BB Library, the reference department. I want to thank you for joining us today for this really interesting presentation on waterfalls of the White Mountains. I'm joined today by Bruce Bolnick, who is the author of Waterfalls of the White Mountains, a book that we have at the library, which is now out in its third edition. Bruce is an economist by profession, but he and his family have been avidly hiking the White Mountains and other places around the world for, decades now. He is also a volunteer as a naturalist locally for the Appalachian Mountain Club, and also as a nature guide for the Ipswich River Wildlife Sanctuary in Topsfield, which is where he lives. Given that everything is closed these days, we are very grateful to Bruce for being able and willing to do this program online, since we can't do it at the library. The good thing about that is you can see it on our social media pages, on our website, at our YouTube page, and also if you want to refer any of your friends to this program, you can let them know that it will also be running on WCAT local Wakefield cable television. So there are many opportunities for you to see this and a number of the other programs that we're doing during the pandemic shutdown. So with that, I'm going to let Bruce take it over, and I will get rid of my face so that you don't have to look at me, and take it away, Bruce.
Thank you very much, Jeff, and welcome everybody. So this is a talk on the waterfalls of the White Mountains. As Jeff mentioned, I'm the author of the book Waterfalls of the White Mountains, subtitle 30 Hikes to 100 Waterfalls. So please join me on a virtual tour of the waterfalls of the White Mountains. We're going to visit some popular waterfall favorites, some roadside gems, backcountry treasures, some great waterfall swimming holes, and some waterfall surprises. And we'll also have some short excursions into some White Mountain history along the way. This is also a book talk, so before heading north for the waterfall tour, I'd like to begin by sharing some stories about the process of producing the book and some of the key features of the book itself. While I'm giving a little bit of background, I'll leave you with a waterfall thought there. So in the spring of 1987, my wife and I had finished climbing the 4,000 footers, and we're trying to think of what to do next. And I decided, hey, it'd be great to start visiting all the waterfalls in the White Mountains. So I looked around, and there was no guidebook to the waterfalls of the White Mountains. The White Mountain Guide from the Appalachian Mountain Club mentioned waterfalls here and there. A few of them were in the index, some of them weren't. What I did is I compiled a complete list of everything mentioned in the White Mountain Guide. I went through the guide and pulled out references to anything about cascades on any of the trails. And then I started looking at maps and went to old maps as well to look at old indicators on the maps. You can see these little lines on the rivers showing what look like waterfalls. And basically I tried to get a master list of all the known waterfalls in the White Mountains. And then in the summer of 87, 88, 89, we went and started visiting all of the waterfalls. But I was very surprised to see that there was no guidebook to waterfalls, period. There was just nothing. The only other hiking guide at the time was by Dan Doan's 50 Hikes in the White Mountains. And he had a couple of references to waterfalls, but not many. But that gave me the idea, well, why don't I just write my own waterfall guidebook? We've been hiking the trails of the Whites for many years, and I should give something back to people by doing the book. I went and saw Dan Doan. He encouraged me to do it. He told me a bit about his publisher, which was Backcountry Publications in Woodstock, Vermont. And we set about visiting all the waterfalls. I drafted 2 sample chapters and sent them initially to the Appalachian Mountain Club because I thought it would be an ideal sponsor for the book. And they rejected it on grounds they thought it would compete with their White Mountain Guide. I was quite disappointed and surprised by that. But I sent it to Dan Doan's publisher, Backcountry Publications in Woodstock, Vermont, and they took it right away. So I had 2 chapters written, and I had a lot of work to do. And at some sacrifice to my academic career, I spent the next couple of years working on the Waterfall book, which came out initially in 1990, the first edition of the book, 30 Trips to 100 Waterfalls, and myself and my wife Doreen as the authors. Now, in between the first edition and the second edition and third edition, quite a few things happened, and I'd like to tell you some of the stories. First of all, I'm very happy to mention that I produced this entire book on a Kaypro II portable CPM computer. This is a computer that was one of the early portable computers. They called it transportable computer. It weighed 26 pounds. It had 64 kilobytes of RAM. It had a 9-inch monochrome display, which at that time was marvelous. And it ran on these 5 1/4 floppy-inch discs. If I were actually giving this presentation live, I would pass them around so that anyone who hasn't seen a 5 1/4 floppy would be able to see it. And those who are a little bit older would be able to have a little nostalgia trip by seeing the 5 1/4 floppy. Anyway, so I produced the whole thing on the Kaypro II. And hold on a second. The book has some special features. It has historical detours, and I'll say more about that. But every single chapter of the book has some history in it. It talks about early explorers and the early settlers, the elegant Victorian hotels, logging railroads, towns that thrived and then disappeared. And we'll come back to some of the history during the talk. There's also a section on weather and hydrology, some photo tips back in the days of film photography. The latest edition has an update on that, as you might expect. Hiking and swimming tips, geological history, and bedrock geology. And for those sections, I had assistance from professors of geology at Northeastern University and also at University of New Hampshire. I had a section on waterfall hazards. I didn't want to publish a book inviting people to visit waterfalls and then have them slip and fall and sue me. So I wanted to make sure that was covered. And then it had a postscript on waterfall bushwhacks, which I want to highlight for a minute. Surprise number one in the process of working on this book is what I call the Phantom Bushwhack chapter. It was one of my favorite chapters of the book. It was about waterfalls that are off trail, waterfalls that people generally don't ever see. Let me just read you a little bit of the chapters and the beginning of this. Every summit, every ravine, every waterfall in the White Mountains was first visited by a bushwhacker. The discoverer may have been an adventurous hiker, a fisherman, or a hunter, a colonial settler, an early explorer, or an Indian brave in the untold years before the colonists arrived. To reach the waterfalls, early visitors often had to struggle through what the earliest colonists called daunting, terrible wilderness, clothed in infinite thick woods. And the purpose of this chapter was to give people the idea that there were lots and lots of other waterfalls that had never been named, that were not on the trails. And the problem was, not everybody liked having this chapter in the book. We received a letter from Guy Waterman. Guy and Laura Waterman were the premier authors of White Mountain history at that time. And they were very well known in the hiking community. And Guy Waterman sent us a note saying that it was a mistake to include this chapter in the book because people should not be encouraged to bushwhack off trail. Guy Waterman, by the way, was the most famous bushwhacker of the White Mountains. He was known, I believe, for visiting every summit in every one of the 4,000 footers in every season from every point of the compass. And he did a lot of bushwhacking. And he didn't mind people bushwhacking. He just didn't want to encourage more people to bushwhack, partly because those who are not really prepared, those who don't know what they're doing, it can be dangerous. And some of the bushwhack sites are really beautifully preserved. And if too many people go, then it could degrade the places that you're trying to get to. He actually wrote a book a couple years later called Backcountry, Wilderness Ethics, and he included a chapter exactly on this issue about why you should not encourage people to go visiting bushwhack waterfalls. So anyway, we had a powwow at dinner that night, my son, my wife, and myself, about whether we should drop the chapter or not. And I wanted to keep it because I really liked the chapter, but I was outvoted 2-1. And so the first printing of the first edition of the book had the bushwhack chapter, and it disappeared after that. So you'll never find that chapter in most of the other books. Hence, I call it the Phantom Bushwhack chapter. Surprise number 2 Well, we got word that a photographer, a very, very wonderful photographer, Bob Coslow from Laconia, New Hampshire, uh, had visited every single waterfall in the book and taken the photos. He contacted Backcountry Publications and said that if they ever did a second edition, he'd be happy to let us use all of his photos for free. And therefore, I'd like to highlight his website, www.bobcoslow.com. He has some wonderful photography and some photography books for sale there. And we actually took him up on that in the second edition of the book. So surprise number 2 was Bob Coslow offering us free photos from a professional photographer. So the second edition came out in 1999. At that time, I was living overseas. My son Dan was in between the Peace Corps and graduate school, and he spent the summer along with a friend named Kyle Vanderland, whose name you'll hear again, revisiting the waterfalls, checking the trail descriptions, checking the parking descriptions, checking the landmarks. So the second edition also featured Bob Coslow photos. There were still a few of mine, but most of them were Bob Coslow photos, which was a huge upgrade. And also the foreword to the book this time was written by Laura and Guy Waterman. They had become our allies rather as a result of our decision to drop the Bushwhack chapter. So the second edition came out. There weren't all that many changes apart from the better photos and some updates on some of the trail description information. So surprise number 3 is in 2007, we got a phone call. We were living down in Virginia, and the phone call was a contractor for USAID, the Agency for International Development. He was running a project for tourism development in Rwanda, and he wanted somebody to write a guidebook to the trails in one of the national parks in Rwanda called Nyungwe National Park. And he also wanted somebody who could not only write trail descriptions and do a guidebook, but also draw maps. So Doreen had been named by somebody as someone who could do this. She had never done any consulting in her whole life. She got this phone call saying, would you like to go to Rwanda and spend some time hiking every single trail in the national park, writing trail descriptions and drawing maps so we could produce a trail guide to Nyungwe National Park. And she at first thought it was a joke, but eventually she agreed to do it. She was actually paid something like $250 or $300 a day to go to Rwanda and go hiking in this beautiful montane forest national park for several weeks. And I had a consulting assignment in Mozambique at about the same time, so I joined her for 2 weeks right at the end of 2007 and did quite a few of the hikes along with her. So anyway, the guidebook took several years for it to come out. Initially, it was supposed to be just some little pamphlets, paper pamphlets about the trails, but it ended up being a beautiful, glossy guide to Nyungwe National Park. And a few years later, we were surprised to find out that National Geographic had named Nyungwe National Park in Rwanda as one of the world's premier unknown tourist destinations. So it actually became, it was quite a hit. The tourism development project for USAID really worked. And this was a wonderful opportunity for Doreen and for me to go hiking in Central Africa. So surprise number 4, remember the Bushwhack chapter. When we got back from living overseas, we were back up at our place in Northeast Kingdom in Vermont, our cabin. And I was shopping at Sam's Supermarket in Whitefield, New Hampshire, and I noticed a rack of postcards, and many of the postcards were waterfalls of the White Mountains. And I thought, oh, that's wonderful. Somebody's doing postcards of the waterfalls. And I started looking at them, and I was amazed that I did not recognize any of the waterfalls in the postcards. I didn't know the names. I didn't recognize the photos. And I looked on the back and saw that these photos and the cards have been produced by Chris Whitten, a photographer who lives in Bethlehem. He works in Littleton, New Hampshire, and he's a fabulous photographer. So I'd like to highlight his website also, www.whitemountainimages.org. And Chris, I contacted him and found out what was going on. And he had the first edition of my book with the Bushwhack chapter. And he told me he was inspired by the Bushwhack chapter to go and look for waterfalls that were not on trail. And the chapter had actually said something along the lines, you know, every mountain stream might have a hidden waterfall. So he started hiking up every mountain stream in the White Mountains, and he found dozens of unknown waterfalls. Some of them were absolute beauties, some of them he named, some of them he didn't name. And then he started producing photos, calendars, and postcards with these waterfalls. Well, so here I found out that there were lots and lots of other waterfalls that I knew nothing about, even though I had tried to compile a master list of every possible waterfall when we started the project. And then on top of Chris Whitten's discovery of lots of new waterfalls, surprise number 5 is on my return from living overseas, I found out that there were now waterfall books about everything in New England. There was Waterfalls of New England by my own publisher, Waterfalls in the Northeast, Waterfalls of Massachusetts, Vermont, Maine, Connecticut. Well, between Chris Whitten finding dozens of new waterfalls that I knew nothing about, and these new waterfall books that gave all the information you need on where the waterfalls are, how to get to them, I was sure there would never be a 3rd edition of my book. Until surprise number 6, the publisher contacted me and said they wanted me to do a 3rd edition of the book. Well, my first reaction was, I can't do a 3rd edition of the book for 2 reasons. One is there are so many new waterfalls that I know nothing about, and there's too much competition now. And also my knees aren't going to do all those hikes to revisit the waterfalls. And in addition, the publisher, Backcountry Publications, it's now Countryman Press, and it's now a division of W.W. Norton, located in New York City instead of Woodstock, Vermont. They said that they wanted us to do a 3rd edition of the book, and they wanted some new waterfalls to be included. And I said, well, there aren't any new waterfalls that I know about. The waterfalls have been there for thousands of years, but I think I could find some that weren't in the book originally. So anyway, what we decided to do was limit the book to waterfalls that are on trail. And that meant that all of Chris Whitten's off-trail waterfalls, I didn't have to worry about. I didn't have to try visiting them. And as far as my knees went, my son's friend, Kyle Vanderland, agreed to do a lot of the hikes, the longer hikes especially, so that I wouldn't have to do them. And he actually took responsibility for 10 of the 30 chapters in the book. So in 2019, September of last year, the 3rd edition came out. It took quite a while to do this. It's a major revision of the book. The changes from the 2nd edition, first of all, this book for the first time has full color photos. Most of the photos are by Bob Koslow and Chris Whitten. It has full color contour maps instead of the pen and ink line drawings that Doreen had done in the first 2 editions. It has updated trail descriptions, GPS coordinates for trailheads, and it does have new waterfalls. In fact, it has 2 new chapters, one for waterfalls in the Sandwich, New Hampshire area, and a second for waterfalls in the Berlin, New Hampshire area. Those are waterfalls that I had not included in the book originally. And in order to maintain the 30 hikes theme, I consolidated a couple of the other chapters where the waterfalls were nearby. So we ended up with same subtitle, 30 hikes to 100 waterfalls, but there are quite a few new waterfalls in the book. I've 6 or 7 waterfalls that were not covered. There's also some new material for the historical detours. As I mentioned, every chapter of the book had a historical section, which I called Historical Detours. And when we were revising the book for this latest edition, I had access to a lot of internet material that had not been available when I first wrote the book, or even when the 2nd edition came out. For example, I could get the 1907 first edition of the White Mountain Guide and find out what the trails looked like in 1907. I could get the 1874 copy of the very first geology of New Hampshire by the state's first state geologist, Professor Charles Hitchcock, and look at his descriptions of the waterfalls. So some of this new material that I was able to get by having access to historical documents is integrated into the historical detours in the chapters of the book. There's also a new section on ecology of the White Mountains. My son Dan, who's now a professor of ecology and evolutionary biology at University of Connecticut, wrote this section on ecology of mountain streams. And there's a section that's not a very big section, but it's pretty important about what you need to know about parking. And the reason I needed to include this is because this is what parking looked like in Franconia Notch as I was working on the third edition of the book. It was crazy. The trails had become so popular that there were cars parked on a nice summer's day, literally a half mile on either side of the trailheads along I-93 through Franconia Notch. And I knew from talking to the Forest Service that this was going to be prohibited starting in 2020, and that other parking restrictions might be put in place later on. So I thought that was a very important addition to the book, to give people heads up about parking restrictions. Today, if you want to visit those popular trailheads, if you get there really early or if you go on a day when it's raining, you'll probably get parking. But otherwise, you have to park at the Cannon Mountain parking lot and take a shuttle. This runs every 20 or 30 minutes in order to get to the trailhead. So that's enough about the book. Let's go to the waterfalls. Head up north and start sampling some of the waterfalls. For the tour, we're only going to do a sampling. We can't possibly cover more than 100 waterfalls that are in the book. But let's get started, starting with popular favorites. So the waterfall on the left, this is Arethusa Falls. And it is considered to be, I'm just looking to see where I am in my notes here. It's considered to be the tallest waterfall in the Northeast. How tall is it? There are various sources that give it heights anywhere from 140 feet to 200 feet tall. And obviously it depends on exactly where you start in terms of the bottom, what you consider to be the bottom of the waterfall and what you consider to be the top of the waterfall. So I went to the 1874 geology of New Hampshire to see what Charles Hitchcock, the state geologist, said about it, and was surprised to see that he did not mention Arethusa Falls. Evidently, he didn't know about it, even though it was within walking distance of the Crawford family lodges, where the Crawfords had been running hiking tours up in the White Mountains up to Mount Washington since 1819. But Charles Hitchcock in 1874 in his Geology of New Hampshire said nothing whatsoever about Arethusa Falls. However, a book published in 1875, 1 year later, by Moses Sweetser, did include Arethusa Falls, and he says that he actually measured the waterfall at 176 feet. So in my book, I used the measurement of 176 feet. I thought that was just a nice number to use historically. The waterfall on the right is Glen Ellis Falls. This is in Pinkham Notch. By the way, Arethusa Falls is in Crawford Notch, just off Route 302. It's a hike of about 1.4 miles each way, and it's a very, very popular hike. Glen Ellis Falls is right near the AMC Pinkham Notch facility, and this is one of the most beautiful architectures of a waterfall in the White Mountains. Both the waterfall itself and the bedrock around it, the stairs coming down from the highway to the waterfall, and then there's a series of beautiful cascades below the waterfall. You can just get a hint of that in the bottom of the photo here. Interestingly, once when we visited Glen Ellis Falls, we saw a woman in scuba diving gear at the bottom of the waterfall, and she was diving into the deep pothole pool at the base of the falls. And we were watching her. She climbed out, and I was talking to her and asked her, well, why are you doing this? And I thought she was a little crazy. And it turned out that when she was diving in waterfall pothole pools, I'm not recommending this for anybody. I don't think it's safe at all. There are some very treacherous currents under these waterfalls, but she knew what she was doing. And she was finding like wallets full of money. She was finding rings. She was finding things that people had thrown in, or maybe angry girlfriends had thrown in. And she was actually coming up with some interesting treasures as a result. So that was an unusual sighting on a waterfall hike. So Arethusa Falls, Glen Ellis Falls. This next slide, two more of the very popular waterfalls. The one on the left is Sabaday Falls, which is off the Concomagus Highway, just east of Lincoln, New Hampshire. And the Concomagus itself is worth visiting, whether you go to a waterfall or not. This waterfall is wheelchair accessible, and it's a hike of, check my notes, 3/10 of a mile off the highway. And it's a beautiful area. If you continue up the trail, not wheelchair accessible. You get to the summit in 4.6 miles of Mount Tri-Pyramid on the end of Waterville Valley. But this waterfall has a series of water spouts and potholes and water spouts and potholes coming down granite ledges. And it's really an absolutely beautiful spot that's heavily visited, especially during the foliage season when the Concomagas Highway can be bumper-to-bumper traffic. The waterfall on the right is a 1 mile hike. It's a little bit harder to get to, but it always has people there because it's on the loop, one of the most popular loop hikes in the White Mountains, the Franconia Ridge Loop. Lots and lots of hikers, hundreds, maybe thousands of hikers every day on a nice summer's day. Well, most of them are climb up the old bridle path trail up to Mount Lafayette, passing the Greenleaf AMC hut, and then cross over from Mount Lafayette to Mount Lincoln to Little Haystack, and then come down Falling Waters Trail. And this is the largest waterfall on Falling Waters Trail. It's about 80 feet high. It always has enough water in it to be interesting. There's some very pretty cascades and some other small waterfalls just above it where the trail crosses the brook. And if you're doing that loop hike, this is a wonderful spot as you're getting really tired at the end of the hike to just stop and relax and enjoy the waterfall scenery. But also you can just go up from the road 1 mile. It's a bit of climbing, but there are several other waterfalls along the way that are described in this chapter of the book, the Falling Waters Trail section of the book. And it's really one of the premier waterfalls in the White Mountains. Just as an aside, I did a couple of attempts at ice climbing when I was a member of a mountaineering club years ago, and Cloudland Falls was the first ice climb I tried. I do not recommend that either. It's an unnatural act, but some people enjoy it. Sampler number 2 is some very short strolls. There are quite a few waterfalls that are covered in the book where you don't have to go very far at all. The one on the left was actually the cover photo on the second edition of the book, and that's Silver Cascade in Crawford Notch, just below the entry to the notch where the AMC Highland Center is. It's actually a roadside waterfall. You can see it when you're driving down the Route 302, but if you only see it for about 2 seconds if you're driving. Fortunately, there are some parking lots right there, and you can get out of the car and come visit it. When there's much water on Silver Cascade, it's absolutely beautiful, and it's a very, very tall waterfall. It's not a single drop like Arethusa, so it's not considered the tallest waterfall in the Whites, but it's a series of cascades coming down the very steep ledges on the side of Crawford Notch. Now, it's estimated usually to be about 300 feet tall, but I found some early historical descriptions that said it was 1,000 feet tall, and I was wondering about that, thinking, did the people back in the early 1800s make a mistake and they view a 300-foot fall and think it was 1,000 feet? I think they were probably smarter than that. So what's going on here? And then I realized that if you take the Webster-Jackson Trail, which starts at the top of Crawford Notch, and you get up to the split where the trail to Webster and the trail to Jackson split, climb down and you cross this same brook, and guess what? There's some cascades up there. So what I'm thinking is that there's actually a continual series of cascades for 1,000 feet, because that point on the trail is 1,000 feet above the road. But most of the 1,000 feet are probably obscured now by foliage that's grown in over the and increased in size over the past 200 years, so that today from the road you can only see 300 feet. But you can still visit the higher cascades by taking the Webster-Jackson Trail up a ways. The waterfall on the right is an interesting story in itself. This is Beatty Falls. There is also a Beebe River Falls that's not in the book. It's right near where the Beebe River flows into the Connecticut River. And the BD Falls, this is in Sandwich, New Hampshire, and it was not included in the book originally, the first edition or the second edition. The reason was, when we were working on the book, we knew about this waterfall and we visited it. And there was a sign in the parking lot saying, "Residents of Sandwich only." So I figured, well, we can't include it in the book because it's not a public access waterfall. It's very near the road. It's just a couple hundred yards off the parking lot at the base of the Sandwich Notch Road. Very, very rough Sandwich Notch Road if you don't have four-wheel drive, high clearance vehicle. But there you can also get it from a very easy half-mile hike on the Bear Camp Trail from just below. And the map is available in the book and other sources as well. But anyway, so several different people, including Bob Coslow, Chris Whitten, Steve Smith, who's the author of the editor of the White Mountain Guide, they said you have to include this in the new edition of the book. I said, well, I can't because it's not public access. Well, I went and visited it again. The sign is still there. But then I contacted the town manager and asked about it. And he or she, I can't remember, put me in touch with the director of Parks and Recreation for the town of Sandwich. And he said, oh, is that sign still there? Actually, we love having more tourists come into Sandwich, so we don't mind at all if you include the waterfall in the book. So Beatty Falls is now in the book. There's often not a great deal of water in here, but it's just such a gorgeous formation that it's well worth a visit. And then below it, the trail continues down just a couple hundred yards to some lower falls that also don't have a great deal of water, but it's a beautiful sunny stretch of granite. So it's a nice roadside waterfall to visit. It may be that the pool is still restricted for swimming to Sandwich residents. That I'm not sure about, but the visit to the waterfall is certainly public access now. Two other roadside falls. The one on the left is in Grafton Notch over in the main section, the eastern section of the White Mountains. And this is a roadside waterfall. It was created as the glaciers retreated and the glacial outwash was just cutting through the granite, creating these beautiful rock formations. There are a couple of other waterfalls right in that same area in Grafton Notch that are certainly worth visiting. And then the one on the right is also just a roadside waterfall. It's up in Dixville Notch, which is the northernmost area covered by the book, outside of Colebrook. And excuse me, just take a drink here. There's a picnic area here as you're driving down Dixville Notch from Colebrook, or as you're starting up, if you're coming from the other direction from Errol. There's a roadside picnic area. And if you stop at the picnic area, you have to walk about 30 feet to get to the bottom of this waterfall. And you look up this flume, it's called Dixville Flume. The waterfall doesn't always have a huge amount of water in it, but it's always very pretty. And the gorge itself, the flume itself, is a spectacular formation. The bedrock up here is quite different from most of the bedrock. And the notch itself has these rock spires that are really quite unique for the White Mountain area. So the Dixville Flume and Dixville Notch, also right across the road, there's another picnic area about 150 yards down the road, and that leads to another waterfall called Huntington Cascades, which is also well worth visiting if you're in the Dixville Notch area. One other thing I think I want to mention, I don't have my notes here, but the Dixville Flume, I did find an actual exact measurement for Dixville Flume, the width, the height, the length, in the 1874 geology of New Hampshire. I thought that was, I enjoyed sort of tracking down that information. Continuing the tour, backcountry gems. So far we've been very popular, easy to reach waterfalls, very short strolls, roadside waterfalls. These backcountry gems are for serious hikers only. These are arduous hikes. These are strenuous hikes. The waterfall on the left is Thoreau Falls. This is in the heart of the Pemigewasset Wilderness area. When people ask me what's my favorite waterfall, my answer is I don't have a favorite. There's so many that I like. But then if they say, come on, what's your favorite waterfall? I say, well, okay, if I have to name one, it's Thoreau Falls. And partly because it's an absolutely gorgeous waterfall. You can see that in the photo. This is taken from the bottom of the waterfall. The main trail to get there comes from Zealand Road, past Zealand Hut. And it's a 5-mile hike in here. And then you get to the top of the waterfall. It's too steep to scramble down, but there's a trail that goes around to the bottom. And I visited many, many times in all seasons. And what's wonderful about it is you not only have this huge, beautiful waterfall, but you're in the middle of the wilderness area with great views from the top of the waterfall across the Pemigewasset wilderness. So that's a great waterfall to visit. And if you happen to be staying in Zealand Hut for a couple nights, it's only a 2-mile hike on fairly flat trail to get over here. In fact, you can even cross-country ski to this waterfall during the winter, especially if you're doing a winter stay at the hut, which is open on a caretaker basis. At least it used to be. I don't know what will happen in the future. The waterfall on the right, this one is called Weetamoo Falls. It's Weetamoo is the name of Wampanoag Sachem. I'm just looking for my note here so I don't get this wrong. Yeah, she was a Wampanoag Sachem during the King Philip's War. She was one of the leaders in the fight of the Indians, the Wampanoags, against the early colonists from 1675 to 1678. The colonists obviously won the war, and Sachem Weetamoo did not meet a very happy end, but it's happy that there's a beautiful waterfall named after her. Now, this waterfall is it's a 5.7-mile hike to get into this waterfall in the middle of the Great Gulf below the headwall to Mount Washington. Now, this waterfall is not worth a 5.7-mile hike to get to all by itself, but the point is that the trail to get there are cascades and cascades and little waterfalls and more cascades and riffles, and it's just the whole trail, the whole 5.7 miles is a beautiful hike with innumerable waterfalls and places to stop and just admire the brook. This is the terminal waterfall on the hike. So the hike is well worth the trip if you're into a really long, hard day hike. Couple more backcountry waterfalls. The one on the upper left is in the Dry River Wilderness, 5 miles up the Dry River Trail from Route 302 in Crawford Notch. This waterfall, there's the trail to get to this waterfall, the Dry River Trail, was destroyed by the tropical storm in 2011. And it took the Forest Service, I think, 3 years to restore the trail. There were blowdowns, there were washouts, and the trail was pretty much impassable. After they restored the trail, then in the Halloween storm in 2017, the trail was again destroyed with blowdowns and washouts. And the Forest Service, I spoke to the head of the Forest Service Trails, and he said, we're not going to put the money and time and effort into restoring the trail. But what they did instead is they're leaving it open as a public trail, but it's called a lowest use, least maintenance Class B wilderness trail. So I know people who've been in here since the trail was severely damaged by the 2 storms. And if you're into a true backcountry experience, a true wilderness experience, where you have to oftentimes you can't actually see the trail anymore. There are blowdowns, there are washouts of the trail, but the trail is still open and you can get there. So this is a real challenging wilderness adventure waterfall. It's a pretty big waterfall. You can't quite see that in the picture here. But for that hike, the wilderness challenge is really the highlight of that hike. You can also get to this waterfall from Mitzpah Hut. There's a trail going down that's also extremely difficult to follow. Or you can come down from Lakes of the Woods Hut. And again, that's on the Dry River Trail, and it's not a well-maintained trail at all. So the final backcountry waterfall, the lower right-hand photo here, this is number 13 Falls, also in the Pemigewasset Wilderness, just below Galehead Hut. The main trail to get in here is the Franconia Brook Trail, and this hike is an 8.1-mile hike along the Franconia Brook Trail. But there's a campsite here, so if you're into backpacking, there's an AMC-run campsite right at number 13 Falls. It's called number 13 because this was actually camp number 13 for the logging railroad that was built in right around the turn of the last century that brought very, very heavy logging in to this part of the White Mountains. And I'll say a bit more about that shortly. But number 13 Falls, there's a vast series of small cascades, small waterfalls, pothole pools, and there's one huge pool that I call the Olympic pool. It's the largest swimming hole that I've seen anywhere in the White Mountains. But it's a difficult hike to get there. If you're spending a couple nights at Galehead Hut, which is a 4.6 mile trip by itself, you can come down the ridge. I think it's 2.3 miles from Galehead Hut on a wilderness trail that's not all that easy to follow, but it's not a very difficult hike. You can get down as a day trip from Galehead to visit number 13 Falls. So enough on the backcountry falls. How about great swimming holes? Now, I've been trying to limit my sampler to 4 waterfalls per category, but this one I couldn't limit to just 4. So we've got, I think, 6 this time. The one up on the left is Franconia Falls. This is, actually it's on the same trail, or it's a spur off the same trail that brings you to number 13 Falls from Lincoln Woods, just outside of Lincoln, New Hampshire. And this is probably an 1/8 of a mile of beautiful polished granite slabs that can be very, very slippery when they're wet. It can be dangerous, and the currents can also be dangerous. People do get killed at these waterfalls by taking risks that when the water is high or when the rocks are slippery. So please be warned about that. What's especially fun about this waterfall is where you see the fellow standing right by a water spout there. There's actually a groove in the granite there that's just big enough for you to sit down in up at the top and then slide down the groove into the waterfall. But I have to warn you that it is very cold. One old guidebook referred to this as the very brother of ice. I've done it several times when I was a lot younger. I'm not going to recommend it to anybody, but I know a lot of people who've enjoyed doing that. The lower picture, that's Lower Falls in the Ammonoosuc River. This is actually just a 1/10 of a mile walk off of a side road in Twin Mountain. And it's where the Ammonoosuc River coming down from Mount Washington passes through this beautiful architecture of layered rock. And there's a series of drops that you can see here in some large pools. This is often, all of these favorite waterfalls are often very, very crowded. The picture here is especially interesting because this is actually a photo from the first edition of the book. And it's showing 3 kids. And the 2 kids on the left who are sitting together, that's Kyle Vanderland and my son Dan, who are co-authors of the current edition of the book. They were teenagers at that time. A couple more waterfall slides. I'll pick up the pace a little bit because of time. The one on the left is Jackson Falls. This is so easy to get to that if you drive into the town of Jackson and ask somebody where is Jackson Falls, they'll just point across the street and it's right there. And there's there's a vast stretch of beautiful Conway granite slabs with waterfalls and potholes and cascades, and there's plenty of room for social distancing here, although I imagine it's going to be so crowded that you might want to avoid it until conditions are a little bit better for traveling. The waterfall on the lower right there is Lower Falls in the Swift River. A lot of tourists go up in the summer, or have in the past anyway, to the Conway area, and they flock to this waterfall on a nice summer's day. This can be as busy as Coney Island sometimes. Here too, very dangerous if the water is high. People have died at these waterfalls. I repeat myself on that. But when the water level is low, it's a really fun place because there's a lot of current coming down the Swift River here. And there are some stretches just above the waterfall where there are little pothole pools that some kids can play around with if you're being careful. Speaking of places for kids to play around, the picture on the left here is it's in Franconia Notch. This is the Basin Cascades Trail, and it's just above the basin. Now the basin, if you've been up there at all, you've probably driven by the basin, and it's the parking lot there is usually jammed, and there are hundreds of people milling around. the basin, which I don't have a photo of here, but that's obviously one of the features. But you get many, many people visiting the basin and then going back to the car. And what they don't realize is that if you go up the trail just a quarter of a mile, you get to this stretch of absolutely beautiful cascades coming down this long bank of granite ledges that is nearly a half mile in length. It's shallow enough so you can walk up most of it right alongside. There are some flat ledge areas where there are little pothole pools where it's very safe for kids to play if you're being very careful and if the water flow is not too heavy and if the rocks aren't too slippery. We used to bring our son here and his friends every time we were driving through Franconia Notch. Not every time, but often we'd stop and go up here and just play in the waterfalls. And we've done that with our grandchildren now too. The lower right, again, getting back to the Conway area, this is Diana's Baths. This area is so crowded that the parking lot is usually full, and the Conway Police Department, starting several years ago, has been policing parking violations. They do not allow people to park on the road outside the parking area. If you happen to get there at a time when there's parking, or if you're patient enough to wait for some cars to pull out, then this is just a gorgeous scene, a beautiful place you can sit under the waterfalls, you can clamber around on the flatter ledge areas and rocks, you can explore up and down the stream, and it's accessible also in the winter. The parking lot is plowed, and the parking lot's not crowded in the winter. In the winter, if there's been a lot of heavy snow, it's just all completely covered by a snowbank. But at other times in the winter, there's less snow, and you can actually see the ice and the cascades under the ice. It's quite nice. So far from the madding crowds. These are waterfalls you could visit if you want to avoid crowds. The one on the left is Pond Brook Cascades, and this is up in the Nash Stream area, just up north of Stark, New Hampshire, which is about 30 minutes north of Lancaster. When I first heard about this, some of my friends who live in Lancaster said it was their favorite waterfall. So when we were doing the first edition of the book, I drove up there. It took me a couple tries to find it. And when I finally found it, I realized that this was a wonderful waterfall in a remote area, but I couldn't include it in the book because it was on private property. However, as I was writing the first edition of the book, the land was acquired by the White Mountain National Forest and some other conservation easements, and it became public access. So I included the chapter in the book, as well as the story about the acquisition of this land by the National Forest. And I very rarely found other people here. Occasionally there are 2 or 3 other people, but there's about 1/8 of a mile of cascades, and you can walk up along the edge of it. It's a little bit, the rock's a little too slippery for you to walk in the cascades, but just above the slides, there are some small waterfalls that you could sit under, and you could follow the stream further up. The waterfall on the right, this is sorry, Lower Bickford Slides. I was going to say Bricket because there's a in Evans Notch in the eastern part of the White Mountains, over by the AMC Cold River Camp. There's a spot where you can park an information kiosk called Bricket Place, and for Bricket Place, there's a trail that goes up. It's about 7/10 of a mile to the Lower Bickford Slides, and then a little further up there, Upper Bickford Slides. This is an area that does not get many visitors, and the waterfalls are as nice as anything you could find for a beautiful hike, and also just a great place to visit and stop and have a picnic. The waterfall on the lower left, I often find 1 or 2 other people there, but I've never seen a crowd. This is Bridal Veil Falls, and it's on the western slope of Cannon Mountain and Kinsman in Franconia. It's off Coppermine Brook. It's one of the most gorgeous formations. It's not a huge waterfall. You can see the scale of it from the man standing there, but it's really beautiful. And the hike to Bridal Veil, it's 2.5 miles in from the road, and it's not a very difficult hike though. And there are some other cascades, some other pretty cascades along the way to make to add to the pleasure of the hike. What's interesting about this one, and the reason that it's not more widely visited, is that there's no trailhead sign on the road. There's no sign for the hike when you actually pull into the road. But if you know, you have to know where it is and know where you're going in order to find the beginning of the trailhead. Once you find the trailhead, there are a couple of twists and turns, some cross-country ski trails associated with Franconia Inn. But when you get to the waterfall, it's gorgeous. We've been there over and over and over again just to enjoy the scenery. The trail stops here. That's the other reason it's not widely visited, is it doesn't continue on to a mountaintop at all. The trail goes here, stop, turn around, go back. But spend time enjoying the waterfall and enjoying the scenery along the way. The other slide in this, the other picture in this slide is Tama Falls. And this is a waterfall where I have never seen a crowd at the waterfall, but I always see crowds 50 feet away. And the trick there is that this is right next to Valley Way Trail that goes up to Madison Hut for people climbing Mount Adams and Mount Madison, or going up to the hut, or doing a presidential traverse from Appalachia parking lot in Randolph. Now, on any kind of nice day, there are loads of people. The parking lot is full. There are people parking along the road. They're going up, and they're so intent on getting up to the summits or up to the hut that they don't pay any attention to the fact that there's this string of beautiful cascades right nearby the trail. And the trail actually goes within about 30, 40, 50 feet of Tama Falls, and I almost never see anybody here. It's really quite remarkable. The Tama Falls, it's on Snyder Brook, and the Snyder Brook scenic area was purchased by the Appalachian Mountain Club in 1895 because the rest of the area was being logged, and logged very, very heavily. Early trail descriptions describe slash all over the area on all of the trails in the northern White Mountains. But this particular Brookside area, the Snyder Brook Scenic Area, was purchased in 1895, so it was never cut. And according to Dave Gravatsky, who's sort of the guru forester for the White Mountains, he says that there are old growth spruce and hemlock trees here. And in fact, one of the red spruce was aged at over 450 years old here. So this is one of the very few places you could see old growth forest. It's a magical place. Waterfall sampler number 6, some surprise waterfalls. The one on the left is a surprise, and again, nobody ever goes there, even though it's right next to a very popular trail. This is called the Gorge, and it's about 1/10 of a mile, even a little bit less. It's a spur trail off of the Ammonoosuc Ravine Trail up to Lakes of the Woods Hut from the Cog Railway. Again, that trail is heavily, heavily used, but almost nobody takes the spur trail over to the spot where this photo is taken. There used to be a little sign on a tree there saying spur, and that little sign was knocked over in the storm in 2017. But the trail is still there. I've been there a couple times since that storm, and it's actually probably one of the most beautiful waterfalls in the White Mountains. And if you look at the picture, right up at the top of this waterfall, that's where the Ammonoosuc Ravine Trail crosses the ledges. If you've done that hike, you go up this very steep headwall section, and then you cross a brook with some cascades above you and a cascade below you. You're at that point, you're at the very top of this waterfall, but it's so steep you can't see the waterfall from there. You have to take the spur trail. The one on the lower right is similarly right off of a very popular trail, but it's a spur trail that nobody goes to. This is on the trail to Arethusa Falls, and there's a little side trail called the Bemis Brook Trail. The Bemis Brook Trail goes off to the left from the Arethusa Falls Trail, and it passes by a beautiful pool called Fawn Pool, beautiful name for a beautiful pool, and then a couple of waterfalls, including one called Brook Falls, and this one, which is called Coliseum Falls. By the way, last time I was here, the sign for Brook Falls and the sign for Coliseum Falls had been reversed. But I double checked all the historical records, and this one is Coliseum Falls. That may have been corrected by now, I don't know. And you can see it looks like a coliseum. It's a very small waterfall, but it's really pretty and really fun because you can walk up and down the ledges here if the water is not too high and if the rocks aren't too slippery. If you're careful, it's a place where little kids can play. I've recommended this little spur trail to friends who have kids 4, 5, 6 years old because I think it's one of the nicest places, the most fun places that you can go with kids in the White Mountains. Hardly anybody's ever there. So, getting near the end, seasonal moods. Here's Arethusa Falls again. I showed you this first waterfall that I talked about, and it shows you in sort of late spring conditions with the foliage fresh, late summer conditions with the autumn foliage showing, and then winter conditions. The trail into Arethusa Falls is pretty well packed down in the winter. A lot of people come in here in the winter, and if you step off the trail, you could sink into the snow up to your hip. But if you stay on the trail and you have micro spikes for the icy sections, you can get in here. And if you're lucky, you can get some special views. This is actually a pretty popular ice climbing spot. It's fun to watch the people trying to scramble their way up, or not scramble, negotiate their way up the waterfall. This gives you an idea of what the ice looks like. Just seeing the ice by itself is splendid. And being out in the mountains in the winter is absolutely beautiful. Diana's Baths I mentioned before. The picture on the left is what I showed you previously. The picture on the right is a picture in the winter when the snow wasn't too deep to cover everything up. And as I mentioned, it is accessible in the winter, and the parking lot is pretty empty in the middle of the winter. This is a waterfall I didn't mention before, Beaver Brook Falls up in Colebrook. This is the northernmost waterfall that's in the book. And it's showing you two different features. On the left, when there's high water, on the right, when there's low water. It's a big waterfall, and it's right at the roadside. And you can see this waterfall right from the roadside. And there's a park with a picnic area right at the base of the waterfall. And the stream below the waterfall, there's some little pools where kids can play as well. But what I wanted to mention about this is that the picture on the left has high water, and it's got autumn foliage. Usually you think of high water as something you encounter in the spring, mud season. It's not all that much fun to hike during the mud season, especially when the black flies are out. But the point I want to make is that if you've had a decent rainstorm, these waterfalls can be really beautiful even in the summer, even in the middle of the summer, even in the late summer, because this is a picture after a summer storm and the water is high, even though this particular waterfall does not drain a large watershed. So oftentimes the water is not all that high at Beaver Brook Falls. Now, to make that point, this is a graph from the book. It's a hydrograph. The U.S. Geologic Survey actually has hydrographs on several of the rivers around the White Mountain area and everywhere else in the country, measuring the river flow in cubic feet per second. And this is available online, hour by hour. You can see the river flow. So what I did in order to provide more details about the hydrology is I found a summer storm from September 1917. And I looked at the Ammonoosuc River gauge in Bethlehem Junction. Now, the Ammonoosuc River drains a huge area starting up at Mount Washington, starting just below Lakes of the Clouds Hut. And I looked at the hydrograph to see what happened to the river flow after this summer storm in September 2017. The units in the bottom here are hours since the beginning of the storm. And you can see that within the first 12 to 18 hours, the water level nearly tripled in the Ammonoosuc River. And then it ebbed a little bit because that first peak was from the immediate water flow near the gauge. But then as the rest of the watershed started feeding the water down the river, then you had this secondary peak. And at about 96 hours after the storm started, the water flow was nearly It was nearly 5 times as high as it had been at the beginning. And then it took 4 days for the water to drop to even 50% higher than it had been at the beginning. So the conclusion here is that you can get some very nice waterfall conditions even in the middle of the summer if you're up there when there's a summer storm. So I have mentioned several times the historical detours. I just want to repeat the fact that this book, unlike the other waterfall books, has a very heavy history emphasis. Every single chapter has a historical section about some of the history or lore, regional lore about the area right around the waterfall. And I'd like to read you just a quick excerpt from the chapter on Thoreau Falls. This is a historical detour about going through the area around Zealand Notch. I quote, "Thank God they cannot cut down the clouds." Thoreau said this of the loggers well before the arrival of the railroads and the advent of wood pulp papermaking that triggered destructive lumbering in the late 19th century. Along with Franconia Brook to the west, Zealand Valley epitomizes the cycle of devastation and regeneration. In 1884, J.E. Henry had begun constructing the Zealand Valley Railroad into the Notch, logging as he went. In those early days, Henry was not clear-cutting. He concentrated on larger spruce trees in what was then a conifer forest. Henry's base was the village of Zealand, located just west of today's Zealand campground. Zealand was then a sizable community, complete with a rail yard, a depot, a mill, homes, shops, and a school. Today, not a trace remains. In 1886, a major fire consumed 12,000 acres of forest in the Zealand area, including virgin tracts well up the Notch. The fire was reportedly ignited by sparks from one of Henry's engines. In 1891, the State Fire Commissioner described the effects, saying, "If there is any sight entirely disheartening, it is that of these fire-denuded tracts from which everything has been swept clean down to the underlying rocks. For 7 miles up the valley, the fire swept resistless across it from crestline to crestline, yet the logging continued, pushing further up the Notch." In 1892, a writer viewed the operations and called Zealand Valley a vast scene of waste and desolation. By 1922, the Appalachian Mountain Club White Mountain Guide, it was the 5th edition already in 1922, cost $3, was still referring to, quote, bare, fire-scarred walls of Zealand Notch. But it also reported that the old rail bed was now choked with young cherry trees. And in 1926, Harrington wrote a guidebook saying that there were alders and poplars and birch growing back as well. In 1933, the Zealand Falls hut opened to the public, and Zealand wilds were being reborn. That's just a taste of the type of historical material that's in every chapter of the book. And if you have the book, I hope you enjoy that. This is a picture just showing you what the devastation looked like at that time. This is the Pemigewasset Wilderness area. And the book, Francis Belcher has a book called Logging Railroads of the White Mountains that describes all of this in great detail. Francis Belcher, Logging Railroads of the White Mountains. So in closing, along the way, there are a lot of other things to see. There are beautiful wildflowers, there's lichen, there's wonderful mushrooms, especially in late September and early October. Wildlife my wildlife picture is an American toad, signs of beaver, signs of moose, stripping moosewood tree. And then also you can just stop along the way and listen to the mountain brook and relax and enjoy the mountain scenery. There are thousands and thousands of beautiful spots along the brooks that are well worth stopping and admiring and just enjoying the peace and quiet. And the trails themselves along the way are part of the adventure and part of the fun of getting there. The Japanese call it forest bathing. You can do that every single trip when you're out on the trail. And I urge you, when you're out there, pay attention to the bird songs as well. That's one of my favorite parts of being out in the woods. So, Thomas Starking in 1868 said, "What folly to attempt to draw in words the curves and colors, the coyness, the flashes and the moodiness, the laughter, the plaints of these daughters of the clouds." The Waterfall book gives you an introduction to all of this, but if you really want to enjoy it, get up there and go out for a hike as soon as it's safe to do so. Shout out to my co-authors, Kyle Vanderland, Dan Bolnick, my contributors, Bob Koslow, Chris Witten for photography, Steve Smith, who wrote the foreword, and my wife Doreen for drawings, and the editors and staff at Countryman Press. And finally, I want to mention the book is dedicated with deep gratitude to the trail builders who opened the mountain paths and to the crews who maintain the trails today. Now, one last thing is that if this were a live show, I would have a box of books to sign and sell at a 10% discount. I can't do that directly right now, and I'm reluctant to put my contact information into a video that could be shared more widely than I would like. So if you're interested in getting a copy of the book from me, you could contact the library, and they could give you my contact information. You can get in touch with me, and I'd be very happy to talk to you, or if you have any questions. Anyway, that's it. Jeff, finished.
Thank you so much, Bruce, for such a great and inspiring, I guess is the word, view of all these places. I've been to a few of them myself, and I think given how much we're all feeling cooped up and wishing that we could get out into nature and sort of releasing a lot of the tension that we're all feeling right now, I think it's so inspirational to see all these places that pretty soon, I hope, we will be able to get out and go to.
I hope so.
And we're very grateful to you for being able to help us do that, particularly, as I said, during a time when we normally can't have people come to the library. The fact that you're able to do this program online is really terrific, because it means that we can get a wider audience for this kind of fabulous nature stories. So thank you very much. As Bruce said, if you are interested in getting copies of his book, we have library copies that you can borrow, but if you'd like to purchase your own, feel free to get in touch with us by chat or email, and we will be happy to put you in touch with Bruce to arrange to get you a copy. So do again check out our website and our YouTube channel for programs like this and other travel and story hour programs, book discussion programs, and so forth. And we look very much forward to having you back in the library as soon as it is safe to do so. So thank you very much, and we hope to see you soon.
Thank you, Jeff.